everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today I want to continue pulling at that little thread in my brain to play with intentional pastel colors. In general, I prefer bright and really deep saturated tones, and so it's been a lot of fun to try to use less color, let it spread over the yarn, and just see where we end up with that. That's something that I've been extremely excited about lately, and we're going to continue doing today. But today we are going to layer 3 different colors very lightly on yarn, on twisted skeins in a steam pan, to try to get something that's a bit variegated pastel, maybe a little bit random. But the goal is to aim for something more pastel, and so I'm very excited. Today we will dye 300 grams of KnitPicks Stroll fingering weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, and I do have a KnitPicks affiliate link to it down in the video description where you can learn more. With dyeing twisted skeins in a pan, I've done 4 and 5 skeins a lot. So 3 skeins is not going to be very crowded, but it will let us get a bit more coverage on the yarn. The 3 dye colors we are going to play with today are Dharma acid dyes in dark navy, forest green, and true black. The dark navy and true black are both extremely pigmented colors. The forest green is a deep color, but not quite as pigmented as the navy. And we really are going to use tiny amounts of these 3 colors to create our colorway. There is always a chance that I will add a bit too much color, and so things will lean more medium toned versus pastel, but that is also okay. So for example, we want to use a little bit of dye. We're just going to use a tiny bit of dye, but if I were to take, for example, 2 milliliters of our black dye and apply it directly to the yarn, even with a lot of water, we might see some spread, but that dye is probably going to stay like in a smaller area. But if we take these 2 milliliters of dye and add it to a liter of water, well, first of all, it's really fun, and I'm kind of sad that you only have the top view, but it's really fun watching the colors swirl through this water. But by diluting it, we will be able to apply the dye over a larger surface area of yarn, which will be really, really beautiful. Plus, give us that more pastel effect. Okay, in our dye bath, I've got our 300 grams of yarn, and we're gonna start by twisting them. Now, you've seen me dye twisted skeins in a pan before, and this is something that I enjoy doing, but the one difference with having them laid out is you have a little bit more control over the placement of some colors. But what we will see is that the dye will be able to access part of the yarn more than others. And so I'm twisting a little bit tighter just to start with, and I'm not worrying about having them like straight. These are kind of like worming a little bit through the pan. Okay, and I'm going to start off by adding 8 cups of water that has almost 3 tablespoons of white vinegar in it. And so this is enough water to give us some nice acid to make sure the yarn is nice and saturated, but we're not yet covering the yarn completely. So I do want to heat things up, and then we'll come back to add our first color. To try to have a little bit more consistency between the skeins, I decided I wanted to add a little bit more water to start with. So this was a container with 8 cups of water and 3 tablespoons of white vinegar, and I added about 6 cups of that. And so now we still need to heat up. We still need to heat up some more, but only a little bit of yarn is above the surface of the water, because my concern before was that if I poured the color on the yarn, some of it might go in between, but dye that fell in this area would just hit those 2 skeins, not all 3. And I want to try to layer it across more. That's my goal, so we'll see how it goes. But we're now up to 14 cups of water with oh goodness, I don't know how much vinegar. A ratio of about 3 tablespoons of vinegar per 8 cups of water. We're nice and steamy. I'm reducing the heat to low. And then we're coming in with our dye. And even with 1 liter, it's not going very far. I think that like maybe I would need like a slightly bigger volume almost. I mean, granted, we still have dye like in these like little areas. I kind of want to make it so that way the dye can like travel around. But I'm not going to worry if we don't have a ton of coverage. We wanted something lighter. We wanted something pastel. The reason why I started with 2 milliliters of dye is that I think I used 6 milliliters of dye total to dye a tonal navy yarn that was, I mean, very pastel. And so that's why I'm going for less, because we have like less surface area. And so even though we have some white visible on the surface, we will absorb color like along the sides and stuff. And so, I mean, I probably shouldn't move things a lot. Rebecca, just let it be. Let it be. Okay, we're gonna wait 10 minutes and then we'll come back. I started so confident and then I started overthinking things, but we're gonna go with this. We're gonna go, there's not very much coverage, but also like, that's okay. So I'm gonna sort of shake the skein around and we're gonna twist it up again. We did have a fair amount of white that was present still on top, but I'm twisting it up a little tightly. And yeah, we're gonna go in with the navy. I'm not necessarily twisting things inside out, and I haven't moved the zip ties at all. We'll move the zip tie for the 3rd color. But it is okay if our colors layer together a bit. And also I know that when I pour, we're going to get some slightly different regions. And if there's still dye in the dye bath that hasn't struck, that's okay as well. So we likely are going to end up with like not a lot of coverage at all on the yarn. But also that's okay, and it's a mood and it's soft. So I think that if I wanted to have more liquid when I was pouring, I think that I would need to start with a bigger volume. 1 liter of liquid isn't really enough to heavily pour over things. So I'm coming in with the dark navy. And this time, I think some of it definitely settled in on top, but I was able to get a lot sort of around the sides as well. And because we have more water volume in here, more of it is going to strike along some of these side areas than it will on the top, I think. I think. But while I'm at it, why not just add like a little bit more acid as well? I'm actually enjoying seeing what's happening. I didn't really know what was going to happen. I didn't know how far I'd be able to spread it. The reason why pastels can be a little bit tricky is because there's so little dye present that little dye can strike to the yarn pretty quickly. And so you really need to take advantage of larger volumes of water to help things spread a bit more. And I have done versions of this technique, twisting skeins in a pan, where I have ended up with a lot of contrast, some saturated colors and white left over. And I've also done it where I've ended up with less contrast, and maybe times with like dry powder where I'm moving things, where I end up with more color coverage in the yarn overall. It depends a lot on the dye, on the acid, on a lot of those factors that are present. But so far, the depth of color is working pretty well, and we're staying in that pastel family. And so that's a win. And so this is definitely a circumstance where I didn't have like a clear vision of what I was going for. I knew that I wanted to layer pastels, and When I start a project like this, I like to have like a rough idea of a plan, but then I like to see what the dyes are doing and lean into that. And so I'm excited to see where we end up with this because I feel like we're gonna have something that is really, really soft. Ooh, I think we're gonna probably need to add a little bit more green because I know the green is more pigmented. I may do 4 milliliters of the forest green because so far we've done 2 milliliters of navy and 2 milliliters of black. And as a reminder, a 1% stock solution is 1 gram of dye dissolved in 100 milliliters of liquid. So 2 milliliters of that is 0.02 grams of dye. That is like the tiniest amount on the tip of a spoon. It is not very much at all. If I was gonna try to take that amount of dye and speckle, I would end up with like a few specks. It would not go very, very far. And so that's something else that's just kind of fun to think about. But when deciding to do this, I know I'm starting with more saturated colors, so I'm using so little dye. If I was starting with like an ecru or ivory premixed dye, and I use this little, we might not see very much at all. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. But yeah, let's go check in on the yarn. There's a little bit of some color left, but not a lot. Ooh. Oh, this is fun. This is really, really fun. Okay, for the next twist, I'm gonna try to carefully separate and move the zip tie while things are hot, just to like reposition things. And I'm checking for large and uninterrupted white areas that don't seem to end in any color. And thankfully I'm not seeing a lot of those because that is what I would want to make sure we get more coverage on. And I'm trying to twist this end a little bit more. You can see that we have enough liquid in here now that things are floating a fair amount. Now there are some, quote, deeper sections of navy, I think from some of those side regions, but overall I think things are looking pretty good because where I see larger white patches, they end in a color, and so therefore that's good. You know, that's what we want. We want to be able to see the color, some color, and basically I don't want something that's like so unbalanced that we can't feel much of anything. So far so good. Okay. Yeah, the good news is that on each of them I see like some amount of color that is all over the skein, or by all over I mean all the way through. Basically, you would hate to be knitting a pair of socks and have like one sock have a lot of color and the next one be mostly white. But anyway, let's go set up for our green dye. Okay, I've got 4 milliliters of our forest green 1% stock solution in a liter of water, and my plan is to use about half of it, a little over half, and then I'm going to put in that residual water with acid that we had from before. Whoa, that shifted the color. Okay, I don't know what I saw before, but I added some of the last 2 cups of water with that vinegar in it, and it just changed. Alright, and so now we have more water and acid for this side to spread that color on. So we're going to have a little bit of where the color is still pastel but a little more concentrated, and then we're also going to have some areas where the color is more spread. And what I can say right now is the yarn is absolutely floating, so while we might see some like, I don't think we're going to get resist from the yarn sitting on the bottom of the pan, which is pretty cool. But anyway, I'm going to wait 10 minutes and then I think we'll open up the skeins and let the yarn absorb things that are left. There's some areas like right here where you feel like all 3 colors in there in a very cool and pretty way. It is very, very subtle but still variegated. We're looking good! We're looking really, really good. It's been 10 minutes And now I'm gonna open up the yarn. It's funny because I'm not feeling as much of the black right now, ironically, but I think that maybe once it's dry we'll see it more because it'll add some dimension. But the blue and green, I mean, we use a lot more green. Now, opening this up, see there's this area, the area that's more pastel, but there is color in there. Like this is what's so weird, because normally I'm like, ooh, is there like a long region that is too pastel? But like going through, then there is color there. So that's not bad or a problem. And this is so subtle, and I feel like on camera, it looks like there's tons of area with no color. And so if I like underexpose it a bit, then you can see more of the like soft shifts. But anyway, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna let this heat for 20 more minutes, and the yarn will absorb. If there's other colors left in, we might absorb a little more color, and that is fine. But we'll also just make sure that everything is nice and well set. The 20 minutes are up, and I am now turning off the heat. This colorway is so soft, but still variegated. There's still like differences. It's not like, ooh, you can barely see the differences there. I mean, maybe on camera. I feel like the camera's not picking it up. Yeah, I like that there's both contrast and not. Like here, I'm like, ooh, here there's like a section of white. But like, it's a large section of white, but it goes into other colors. And white is a color in here too. And so I think it'll look, I mean, it's really fun. It definitely could have been even more pastel. I could have used even less color and we would have still had something, but I'm really happy to feel just this little bit of contrast and something really, really light overall. And so now I am going to set this aside to cool so we can wash it. And as for the dye bath, I'm actually going to reuse this for another project. I had some questions recently on ways that you can conserve more water when you're doing a dyeing project. And one of those ways is reusing your dye bath over and over. And so if I wanted less water volume, I could take some of this and set it aside in a jar and then add it back in as needed. We still got acid in here, so it's good for other projects. And so that's what I'm going to do with it myself. Let's wash our yarn. And while I do, I now can't remember if it's this video or the one I was filming immediately after where I was talking a little bit about water usage, but this water I'm starting with was the last rinse for another skein of yarn, so that way I could reuse it. And if I weren't filming and therefore changing the water, I might have like 3 buckets set up. One that was just a rinse plain water, one with some soap, and then one to help rinse out that soap in the end. And then I could reuse it for more than 3 skeins of yarn, assuming that they aren't things that bleed. But this yarn is really, really pretty. Yeah, and so just like reusing dye baths, I could reuse water from these stages as I'm rinsing out the yarn. I'm not adding some dish soap. And sometimes I actually use my pre-soak water for, well, I reuse my pre-soaked water to pre-soak for multiple videos, but then sometimes I reuse that water again for either dye baths or for rinsing. But yeah, I'm not expecting any bleeding. We don't have a lot of dye here, but this color is so, so pretty. So I am gonna go ahead and rinse out all of this soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and then hang it up to dry so we can see what it looks like once dry. And I have a feeling it's gonna look more pastel than now because that's typically what happens. This yarn is so, so cute. I really enjoy dyeing twisted skeins. I think it's a fun way to layer on color and allow sections to be somewhat random, but still allowing all the colors to show through. We have a lot of, I don't know if it's exactly white, but we have, it's either the bare white color or something extraordinarily pastel that we can see, and it works with these colors in such a beautiful and soft way. There are differences between the three skeins, but what I enjoy about this is that there are some random elements that are also therefore somewhat non-repeating. There's some areas that may have a longer section of white or a shorter section of white, and that is okay. The one thing I was kind of keeping an eye on is that if we have a long section of white, does it turn into something else or does that continue? And because sometimes when you're doing twisted skeins, the same part of yarn can be stuck on the inside over and over. And I don't see anything that is different with the white as I do like with colors. I think that it all works really, really well. These three skeins were dyed at once, and there are some dye lot differences. In hand-dyed yarn, there's often differences even within one dye lot. Yarn dyed in the same pan with the same dyes at the same time. Especially when you bring in a component like twisting or something to it. That adds just a little bit of something different to the project, and some of this variation skein to skein is part of the beauty of hand-dyed yarn. And I don't think I can say it enough times, but if you are knitting with hand-dyed yarn and don't want there to be any variation or obvious difference when you go from one skein to another, blend them together for a few rows. Mix them together a little bit. And try to embrace that really unique, awesome feature of hand-dyed yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and would you like to see me play around more with pastels? I have been on a little pastel filming kick lately. I'm likely spreading the videos out in my schedule so that way they aren't all pastel, all back to back. But I'm finding it really, really exciting to use so much restraint, because usually I just like to add more and more and more and more color. Please subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me know below if you want me to play with more pastels or if you want me to go back to some brights and saturated colors. I mean, honestly, I'm very likely to do some of both, but I also really enjoy trying to challenge myself as a dyer and try things that I'm not as confident with, because sometimes I get results like this that I'm really, really proud of, and it sort of helps me rethink what I want to create. If you want to support the channel on another level, I do have a Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/ChemKnits, and there are some really cool perks for patrons, so you should go and check that out. Thank you so much for watching.